All right, so I am starting to come down with a cold, and that sucks because no one ever says, yeah, I got a cold. Life in Kentucky sucks. Like, I need to rent an apartment in Florida and just like live in Florida for the winter time, and then come back to Kentucky in the summertime. That's what I need to do because Kentucky sucks in the wintertime. Anyway, so we're covering Civil War. The problem, or I guess Civil War II. The problem with this is that Civil War II is massive. I mean, it's 8 parts. It really feels like it could have been like 16 parts, 16 regular issue comics, but it still works out pretty well. I mean, maybe closer to like 10 or 12, but it still comes out pretty solid. And so what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna split this into 2 parts, and both parts will be out today. So I won't make you guys wait like a week, for part 2. But there was actually an interview that was done with Axel Alonso and I think Joe Quesada. They were 2 separate interviews, and both of them basically said that like Civil War II was done to capitalize on the movie. Like that was really the only reason why it was written. They had to plan it out in a really short amount of time in order to capitalize on the film. Now that didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me because Captain America Civil War was based on Civil War I. But in any event, what this story does is it actually opens up with the introduction of a new Inhuman named Ulysses. Now, for those of you guys who are just now getting into Marvel Comics, and I imagine there's probably a lot of people who are just now jumping on board, Marvel's kind of been doing this push of the Inhumans, not really like eclipsing the X-Men because the X-Men are getting their own solo stories, so it's not like they're being shunted off to the background, but the Inhumans are certainly being moved out of the realm of obscurity because that's really the way it used to be. Forever and ever and ever, the Inhumans were backup features in like Fantastic Four. They were backup features in like Thor stories. They would have mini-series like Inhumans Volume 2 by Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee, but it was never like, an ongoing thing. The Inhumans never really had like top billing, I guess, in Marvel Comics. And so because of this, during the events of Infinity, when Thanos invaded the planet Earth looking for a son, the conflict between Thanos and Black Bolt led to the detonation of the Terrigen bomb, which allowed the Terrigen mist to spread across the world and start awakening new Inhumans. But what it also did is allow writer Charles Soule to start expanding on the Inhuman mythos, telling us that where we previously thought it was just the Inhumans in Attilan, that there were actually Inhuman camps all around the world that nobody knew about. And they had been existing for hundreds or thousands of years, but they were just operating in secrecy. It was actually kind of a cool concept. But it also allowed Marvel to come back and to basically bolster the roster of the Inhumans. Now, things were also kind of shaping up too and changing around a bit in terms of all new, all different Marvel. For example, Johnny Storm is back. He was one of the first members of the original Fantastic Four to reappear in Marvel Comics, but he's currently with Medusa right now. Of course, we have Beast with them and so on and so forth. But the Inhumans are really kind of split into 2 groups, right? I mean, it's basically kind of like the situation where you have one group that does field stuff, where they go out and find new Inhumans, and then you have Medusa just kind of ruling from the Inhuman city and taking those Inhumans who have been discovered and then giving them leadership, giving them direction. And so it's kind of a 2-sided operation. But from here, we basically pick up with New York and downtown Manhattan. And the reason why is because we essentially have all the Avengers, or at least all new, all different Avengers, not to mention the Inhumans, and we have Thor. We have a multitude of different heroes all coming together for the purpose of fighting off this celestial destroyer. Now, this destroyer is a plot point. I mean, it's not like something that we're going to see later on. I mean, it's not a major focal point, but what it does do is it shows us how dangerous things could be, and it shows us how important Ulysses is, at least the way that Brian Michael Bendis is presenting him to us. And the reason why I say that is because, while everybody's kind of celebrating and everybody's like, yeah, we did a great job, guys. We defeated the celestial destroyer and sent it back to its own dimension and so on and so forth. The question is asked by Tony Stark and Carol Danvers and a few others, how was it, who tipped us off? I mean, because at the end of the day, they were all just kind of called to this location to fight this celestial destroyer. There was no real answer in terms of, who it was that brought them all together. And what happens here is Medusa of the Inhumans introduces them all to Ulysses. And this is where things start to spiral out of control. Now, a lot of people will say that Civil War II lacks the grandiose nature of Civil War I in the sense that Civil War II was like super rushed. But one of the things a lot of people tend to forget is that Civil War I, it was one moment Tony Stark and Captain America were friends, the next moment they were enemies. I mean, it was literally the instance where S.H.I.E.L.D. tried to arrest Captain America and he jumped off the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier and went underground, that suddenly he was a bad guy. So it was the turn of a page that Captain America was now a vigilante. And that's really what Bendis is giving us here. And this is kind of the cool thing, because for me, in Civil War II, Bendis really invokes like these fundamental emotions, right? Like as we go through this, you're going to hate Carol Danvers. There's no 2 ways about it. You are going to hate her character. But the fact that Bendis can craft this story in such a way that you just hate her, that you're just like, all right, Carol Danvers is the worst person in the history of Marvel Comics, shows us how good of a writer he is in terms of situational storytelling. And that's why I say I think Bendis is a better writer when it comes to developing characters than he is doing major crossover events. I feel like he's really, really good at creating a character, developing that character, and then setting that character loose into the Marvel universe. I think he's super good when it comes to that kind of thing. But again, the idea of Ulysses, a mutant who can see the future, raises a lot of questions. And so one of the first things that the superheroes do is they basically grab Jean Grey. Now, keep in mind, this is all new X-Men Jean Grey, right? So this is Brian Michael Bendis's all new X-Men before Secret Wars happened, when Beast went into the past and grabbed the younger X-Men and brought them into the present day. And so it was basically a way to kind of reinvigorate the X-Men series without, going all the way back to the very core roots of it all. And so because this is basically the young Jean Grey, the one that Old Man Logan's really creepy about, where he's like creeping all over her. It's weird. Like it's weird. That's the best way to put it. It's weird. In any event, Jean Grey is kind of like the go-to psychic, the go-to telepath. Because remember, Charles Xavier isn't here. We have no idea where Charles Xavier is. As far as I know, he's gone. And so because of this, with Jean Grey going through, what she says is, I am essentially going to cordon off a part of your mind, at least a part of your mind that deals with these visions. You're going to have a vision, and then I'm basically going to act as an anchor, and I'm going to allow everybody else to see these visions that you're having. The problem with this is that when Ulysses tries to undergo the process of creating a vision, in the end it's revealed that his mind simply can't be read, that it's not possible for Jean Grey to tap into it. Now, this raises even more questions than it answers, because the issue now is, well, is Ulysses immune to telepathy? Is he like a cosmic entity? Is he some wildly powerful equivalent of Omega level mutants when it comes to Inhumans? What's the whole deal? Now, because of this, because of the fact that he's essentially like a black box of information, it creates some very serious trust issues, because right off the bat, Carol Danvers is like, yeah, man, like we trusted him, and he told us a celestial destroyer was going to show up, and then it did, and then we defeated it, and it was only possible because of him. Like, he is the future. He's going to be a way for us to stop crimes from happening. But Tony Stark's like, man, I don't know. There's this Inhuman that we know nothing about. We can't read his mind. We don't know his motivations. We don't know how his powers work, and we're going to take it as an absolute truth that what he's telling us about the future is actually going to happen. It creates a really cool situation, because again, this is very much the idea of, if I go to you, if member of the Rob Corps, you watching right now, let's say your name is Steve. I have no idea if your name is Steve or not, but let's say your name is Steve, and I say, Steve, you're going to win the Powerball jackpot of $100 million on Saturday. Now, if you go and you buy a Powerball ticket and you win, did you win because you were going to, or did you win because I told you you would, and you wouldn't have bought a ticket if I didn't tell you that? That's the situation that's being presented here. Is which one is it? Is it chicken come before the egg, or did the egg come before the chicken? And so it creates a really weird situation for all the superheroes, because they're trying to understand how it all functions. The other half of this is that we essentially get the backstory of Ulysses. Now, there's not a whole lot to offer here within the confines of the main Civil War story itself. I think we actually got a tie-in more or less to the Civil War event that focused heavily on Ulysses. He's an interesting character, but he's kind of a one-off. I mean, it's one and done with him. But all it really says is that, he was at his Ohio University, or I guess at Ohio State. The Terrigen Mist came through. He emerged from his cocoon. He didn't feel different, but then suddenly he started having visions of the future. And this is why I say things begin to switch around, and things begin to create a rift between Carol Danvers and Tony Stark. Now, the cool thing about this is that Bendis does not make this rift immediate. I mean, it is to a degree, in the sense that they don't really see eye to eye, but it's really more of like a disagreement, or like a heated debate, as opposed to, if you go through with this, Carol Danvers, I'm going to kill you. It's not like that. It's not that violent, but it is enough for us to know that things are going to be going in a screwed up direction. Now, from here, we jump back to New Attilan, again, off the coast of New York, and we basically have, Ulysses having another one of his visions, and he ends up, calling in Medusa and says, we need to grab the Ultimates. Because remember, the Ultimates are like the Ultimate Avengers. They are essentially the Ultimates from the Ultimate Universe, which was like the Ultimate Universe version of Avengers. They were the Ultimates rolled over in all new, all different Marvel with the same name, but given a different role. They were just more on a cosmic scale kind of situation. But the idea here is that with Ulysses calling in the Ultimates, we know something huge is going to happen. And so what we do is we transition over to Tony Stark's laboratory. Now, keep in mind here, he still has his AI Friday. And Friday actually came before Secret Wars. She was a really cool concept, but then we still, or I guess we also have Mary Jane Watson running the show. Now, Mary Jane Watson running the show was part and parcel to the events of Invincible Iron Man under Brian Michael Bendis, I think. And it was really just a situation, I can't remember what it was that Tony Stark was doing, but he had done something and it screwed things up, and the board was trying to kick him out. And what they needed was somebody who can operate in his stead in a business capacity. And then Mary Jane Watson was brought on board to basically say, I speak on behalf of Tony Stark, and you guys need to get the hell out of here, or you guys are all going to end up being broke. That's the reason why Mary Jane Watson is here at the moment. I know that part of that is like the Amazing Spider-Man. I know that in Amazing Spider-Man, a lot of that was covered, and it was kind of a back and forth between Spider-Man and Iron Man. But, having his attention drawn by Friday and Mary Jane Watson says, Rhodey's basically gone. It's the message, Rhodey is dead. And so from here, this is where the rift really begins to grow. This is the point at which it's the event horizon. It's the point of no return. It seems like there's really no way that this rift can be mended between Tony Stark and Carol Danvers, because remember, Rhodey is the closest friend that Tony Stark has had for quite some time. And so what we learn is that Ulysses had told Carol Danvers, look, Thanos is coming. And when they went to go ambush him, it resulted in all of them being crushed, a lot of them being defeated. Now, of course, Thanos was defeated defeated. But the issue is that Thanos is not a cakewalk, you know, even on his weakest days. Even when Thanos is at his weakest, he is still wildly dangerous because you're talking about a guy with thousands of years worth of experience. You're talking about a guy with some of the most advanced technology in the universe, a guy with all kinds of battle-hardened tactics. I mean, Thanos has fought Galactus and survived to tell the tale. So you're talking about a very formidable threat, you know, with intelligence and the whole 9 yards. And during this conflict, James Rhodes had basically been killed, and She-Hulk was injured to the point that she had to be hospitalized. Now, this is why the rift is created, because in the mind of Tony Stark, Carol Danvers is at fault here. You know, Carol Danvers led them into a conflict against Thanos, against one of the most powerful beings in the Marvel Universe, you know, and because of her foolishness, because of her foolhardy nature, because of the fact that she just trusted the vision of a guy that she knows nothing about, she effectively got James Rhodes killed. And so because of this, what we end up doing is we actually switch over to Tony Stark that night when he ends up traveling after and trying to find Ulysses. Now, for those of you guys who are reading Hydra Captain America, this is why I say Nick Spencer changes the entirety of Civil War. Hydra Captain America was a storyline that came after Avengers Standoff, when the Cosmic Cube basically reformed into Kavik, this young girl that was used by the Red Skull to effectively warp the past of Steve Rogers and alter it so that he was always an agent of Hydra. Nick Spencer, while all this is going on right now, you know, while Tony Stark is fighting Medusa, it's in the home of the Inhumans, you know, while he's trying to kidnap Ulysses, all of this is being watched by Steve Rogers. And we don't see it here. It all happens off panel. That's why I say, like, Nick Spencer's Captain America is a really, really cool thing, because it gives us the other half of this and it really bolsters this. As a Hydra agent, this is what Captain America wants. He wants the Avengers to effectively fall, or at the very least, to be fractured to the point that they can never really be whole again. The problem with this is that Tony Stark's still wildly intelligent, and to be honest here, with the exception of Hank McCoy, there's really no one here right now among the Inhumans or the Avengers that really matches up to his level of intelligence. I mean, the smartest people in the Marvel Universe right now are really just Tony Stark, Hank McCoy, and Black Panther. I mean, that's really, you know, Reed Richards isn't here. I guess you have Dr. Doom, but he's off doing his own thing right now. He's not really part of the equation. But in terms of the Civil War II event, those are really like the three top guys. And Black Panther doesn't care what happens as long as nobody attacks Wakanda. And so because of this, it really just leads, you know, the idea that Tony Stark would have broken into New Attilan, the fact that he basically kidnapped Ulysses while tricking the Inhumans into believing that he was fighting them, basically creating a decoy, it's essentially created a circumstance where he's effectively waged war against the Inhumans. Now, the reason why he did this is because for Tony Stark, just accepting the visions of Ulysses as an absolute truth is not good enough. Tony Stark is a man of science, all right? Tony Stark wants to be able to sit down and say, this has to be able to be traced. I have to be able to find a way to verify that this is true. You know, if I can do that, then I can say, okay, let's trust this. But if I don't know how it works on a very core, very fundamental level, you know, at its very essence, then I won't take it as absolute truth. And so what he begins to do basically is he doesn't really torture Ulysses so much as he begins the process of trying to stimulate him in such a way that it'll produce villains. So, you know, scaring him, threatening to beat the hell out of him, different things like that. Now, he doesn't really have like a vision per se, but the part of his brain that basically controls these visions, the frontal lobe, or at the very least, the part that would see these visions, begins to light up more so than it should. And so at the very least, Tony Stark's been able to deduce that the activation of these visions are based on his emotional state. Now, this will actually become a very important thing later on down the line as we get further into the story. But what ends up happening is, of course, Carol Danvers basically shows up and says, hey, look, you kidnapped a member of the Inhumans. You effectively waged war against the Inhumans themselves. We want to try to keep this tone down. We don't want things to get escalated. But what we do want to do is effectively take you into custody for kidnapping. Now, while this whole debate is going on, while this whole argument is going on, Ulysses begins to have one of his visions. And the vision that he has is of the Incredible Hulk basically just rampaging and killing everyone. Now, something else I'd like you to keep in mind about these visions of Ulysses is that all these visions are apocalyptic in nature. That's something that I hope you've seen so far. The vision of Thanos attacking everybody, the vision of the Celestial Destroyer, the vision of the Incredible Hulk. It is people just losing their minds, you know, villains coming in or some entity from another dimension coming in and laying waste to everyone. And there's a reason why Brian Michael Bendis is doing this, and we'll find out at the end of all this. But Ulysses, you know, when he has this vision, for the first time since he began having them, he's able to share them with people so they feel what's going on. They see what's going on. It's like they're in the vision alongside Ulysses. And so what they've basically discovered, or at least what they've been led to believe, is that the Incredible Hulk has reemerged from Bruce Banner and basically killed everyone. And so because of this, it leads Carol Danvers to again stay proactive and to say, okay, we're going to be going after Bruce Banner. Like, we got to find a way in order to curtail this whole thing. Now, what this does is this actually picks up in a courthouse. Now, the cool thing about this is that Bendis starts jumping back and forth between this trial and the events as they've unfolded. So basically, we're being told what's happened by way of this trial. But essentially what had taken place here is Carol Danvers had shown up and said, okay, Bruce Banner, you need to come with us. Now, this is where when I really just started hating Carol Danvers, because I'm just like, well, the guy hasn't done anything. Like, you come knocking on his door and you're like, you're under arrest. It's like, why? It's like, well, because somebody said you will do something later on. Because that's really what Carol Danvers is going on here? She's going on hearsay. That's really it. This guy Ulysses is like, hey, that guy's gonna do something, and then Carol Danvers is like, okay, let's arrest him. That's really what it is. I mean, she's just going on the belief that what Ulysses is predicting is actually true. Now, the other half of this is that Bruce Banner is experiencing an insane amount of betrayal. Because keep in mind, despite the fact that he has been the Incredible Hulk, although at this point, it's really like the Incredible Hulk essence has kind of been transferred to Amadeus Cho. And so Amadeus Cho is the Incredible Hulk. Because of the fact that he's been the Hulk in the past, there is some measure of distrust in the sense that people don't know if the Hulk is going to reemerge again and what'll happen if it does. But as Bruce Banner, he's one of the most respected people in the entirety of the Marvel Universe, one of the most respected people among all the scientific community. I mean, there have been instances where people who distrust him because of the fact that he's the Incredible Hulk would go to him and ask him for help. And in fact, that's the whole crux of the Red Hulk storyline that we're doing right now in World War Hulks, is that Thunderbolt Ross doesn't trust Bruce Banner, but he does need his help. And so again, it creates a really interesting scenario here. The problem with this is that as he's basically being interrogated, you know, when Carol Danvers is coming along and saying, look, we have reason to believe that you're going to turn back into the Incredible Hulk again, when they basically have Hank McCoy hack the files of Bruce Banner's computer and discover that he's been experimenting on himself using dead gamma cells, all arrows seem to point to the idea that Bruce Banner is trying to find a way to reactivate the Incredible Hulk. Now, we don't know the full story here. You know, Bruce Banner tries to explain and say, hey, look, these experiments that I'm doing are the only reason why the Incredible Hulk hasn't emerged over the last year. And so it's entirely possible that Bruce Banner was using these dead gamma cells to verify that the cells are dead and that they're staying dead, or at the very least to understand why those cells are dead and how to keep them from reactivating so the Hulk will never come back. We don't have the full story. Instead, in the midst of being interrogated by Carol Danvers, in the midst of being betrayed by a lot of his friends, he's suddenly killed by a rogue arrow. Now, at this point, this is where we learn the basis of this trial. The reason why this trial has been put together is because Hawkeye killed Bruce Banner. He shot him through the eye with an arrow. The reason why Clint Barton did this, though, is when he basically says that Bruce Banner asked me to. Now, this is where things begin to get a little iffy, because according to Hawkeye's testimony, and as far as they know at this particular moment in time, Hawkeye's the only one that can verify this, or the only one that really has any information on this. What he says is Bruce Banner sat down with him one day and said, hey, look, on the off chance that I ever turn into the Incredible Hulk again, here is an arrow of my own design. Use it to kill me. You know, take me down and keep me from being able to Hulk out. Now, Bruce Banner didn't specify, as far as I've been able to tell, he didn't specify if he meant for Hawkeye to wait until he became the Hulk, or for Hawkeye to be in a situation where it looks like he's going to become the Hulk and then take him out. It seems like it was really just kind of left at Hawkeye's discretion. And that's what Hawkeye says. You know, Clint Barton says, look, Banner told me that if there were ever a circumstance where he looked like he was going to Hulk out again, put him down. I made a judgment call based on what Banner told me. Not only that, when Hank McCoy is called to the stand, Hank McCoy says this custom arrow tip was basically designed by Bruce Banner. It looks like it was invented by Banner himself. There's also a video diary where Banner basically says, I have asked Clint Barton to kill me if I ever end up becoming the Hulk again. Now, this is where the subtleties of law begin to come into play, because the question that's being asked here is, okay, if Bruce Banner told you to kill him if he ever became the Hulk, does that mean that he wanted you to kill him if he was going to become the Hulk, if it looked like it, or to kill him after he became the Hulk? And Hawkeye basically says, I was never given a definitive answer here, but I did what Bruce Banner asked me to do. Bruce Banner said, if it ever looks like he's going to become the Hulk, I should shoot him. And so because of that, he basically killed him. Now, the reason why this is important is because this is going to be one of the things that creates a rift in the superhero community, but it's also going to be one of the reasons why Hawkeye becomes very popular among the Avengers. Not only that, the question is asked of Carol Danvers regarding, you know, this whole use of Ulysses as, you know, as part of this pre-crime initiative, whether or not it's actually successful. And what she says is, yes, it's been successful more often than not. There have been a couple instances where Ulysses hasn't necessarily been right, but they have been able to use this to prevent crimes from happening. Now, the other half of this is Tony Stark steps up and Tony Stark says, that doesn't matter. We don't exist here for the purpose of being proactive. You know, we don't exist here for the purpose of taking people out before they commit crimes. You have to let them commit those crimes and then arrest them. Otherwise, anybody could be arrested for anything. You don't actually give them a chance. You basically remove free will. Now, a lot of people will look at Tony Stark from Civil War I and say, well, it seems like he's just reversing things now. You know, he's ignoring his own past. That's actually not true. Tony Stark during Civil War I was reactive. You know, he was reacting. All he simply said was superheroes need to be registered. They have to hand over their identities. They have to hand over what their superhero names are. They have to hand over what their powers are, and they have to operate on behalf of the government. What he wasn't saying is, let's arrest people before they commit crimes. Now, they are two separate arguments in terms of the impact that they have, but in all honesty, I would say that Tony Stark wasn't wrong, and I'd still say he's right when it comes to the first Civil War event, because my argument's always been, of what use is free will to a society that would use that free will, you know, use that freedom to destroy itself? If a society uses uses freedom to destroy itself, then freedom was pointless in the first place. You know, keep society going, even if it means that you make them live in conditions they otherwise wouldn't want to live in, a totalitarian kind of government. And so because of this, I always kind of sided with Tony Stark on that. But again, I'm kind of digressing here because I really love the moral arguments of Civil War I. But for Tony Stark, you know, looking at the death of Bruce Banner, for him, he really looks at this as Carol Danvers is screwing up all the way. And in a lot of ways, he says, look, Carol Danvers has a hit list. Carol Danvers is taking out heroes that she thinks are a threat to her. She took out James Rhodes. She took out the Incredible Hulk. Who else is she going to take out next? Is she going to take out Captain America? Is she going to take out, you know, Nova? Is she going to take out Spider-Man? You know, who all is she going to take out next? And again, this is really just Tony Stark being angry. This is him lashing out just because of the fact that he's still so emotional about James Rhodes. But what also happens here is the Friday AI sits down and says, look, I've been analyzing the brain of Ulysses. I'm not 100% on what it is that it's capable of yet, but I do have a reasonable argument that I can make here. And what seems to be going on here is that Ulysses' brain is not 100% accurate. It's not 100% perfect. Now, this was also something that was covered by way of Captain America Steve Rogers, because Steve Rogers discovered almost right off the bat that Ulysses' predictions were not 100% accurate. Because when it came to someone who said, I could see the future, and here's the future that's going to happen, all it takes is one incorrect guess to verify that he's not 100% accurate. Because when you're dealing with absolutes, the instant that absolute stops being absolute, it throws in doubt. And so Steve Rogers had discovered somewhere along the line where Ulysses was basically wrong. And so he said, okay, fine, let's use this and let's turn the Avengers against each other. So keep in mind, behind the curtain and all this stuff, you know, the man behind the curtain is Steve Rogers, and he's pulling the strings. He's the reason why these Avengers keep going against each other. He's the reason why they keep fighting one another, because he's basically engineered this entire situation. Again, you can find my Captain America video down in the description. At this point, we basically pick up with Carol Danvers breaking the news to She-Hulk, you know, and she tells She-Hulk, look, you know, Bruce Banner's dead. Hawkeye killed him. Hawkeye said that he was asked to kill Bruce Banner by Bruce Banner himself. He's been put on trial for it. And when She-Hulk says, what was the verdict? Was Hawkeye found guilty or not guilty? We learn that Hawkeye basically walked, that Hawkeye was free. Now, the cool thing about this is that Miles Morales provides some insight here when he basically says that there's never really been a case this riveting before, because a lot of people looked at the situation as it was and said, well, I mean, Bruce Banner asked Hawkeye to kill him. It was a mercy killing. It was, you know, he euthanized him basically. You know, it was assisted suicide. You know, it was Bruce Banner asking for something and Hawkeye giving it to him. Who is anybody to say that it's wrong? Now, the idea that creates a really compelling argument in and of itself. You know, the moral philosophical argument of, if someone asks you to kill them, is it okay for you to do it? You know, you're literally granting a wish that they want you to hand over. But again, it creates kind of a weird situation, because what this is doing is adding in so many themes. But this is one of the reasons why Civil War II was kind of hard to follow, because it was so much stuff packed into a really, really small story, packed into a really short story. Honestly, this should have been a lot longer than it was. But what we end up doing here is we basically pick up with Tony Stark, and Tony Stark could. My dog's dreaming right now. I really hope you guys can hear that. But for Tony Stark, this creates kind of I know I keep saying it's kind of a weird situation, but it really is in a lot of different ways, because for him, again, he's looking at this from a science perspective. It's not enough for Tony Stark to sit down and to say, hey, look, you know, maybe it's just a guy that has these weird powers. Everything has an origin. Everything has a function in terms of how it works. And what he says is, this guy Ulysses, you know, if he sees the future, then he wants to know everything about him. I mean, if these visions affect him emotionally, then it stands to reason that his emotions affect the visions of the future. And so if he has a vision of the Incredible Hulk, but he's scared, then does that mean that his vision will be a terrifying vision? It'll be a vision that'll reflect his own fear, in the sense that he's like, well, the Incredible Hulk is a very scary being. And so when I have a vision of the Incredible Hulk, I don't see the Incredible Hulk running around, you know, like frolicking around in a field full of daisies. I see the Incredible Hulk killing all the superheroes, because that's the worst possible situation for me to see. And so that's what Tony Stark is asking. He wants to know if these are legitimate visions, or if these are visions that he's just kind of spouting out that reflect his own personal concern. Not only that, what Stark also says is that the mind of Ulysses works in such a fashion that it basically just draws on the existing energy around him, and then it basically spits that energy back out in the form of a vision. And so it is essentially like if you were standing in a room and you had pieces of paper all around you, and you gathered up all those pieces of paper, which are just forms of energy. It doesn't matter what kind of energy it is, it's just forms of energy. You gathered all those pieces of paper up, and then you handed it to somebody and you know, if you handed it to your brother or sister or somebody like that, and you said, this is a vision of the future. It's not actually the future that he's seeing. What his brain is doing is his brain brain is grabbing all these different energies that reflect what it is that's going on right now. So the conflict on the other side of the world between these two warring states, Bruce Banner, working on his research of the Incredible Hulk, Carol Danvers having it out for Tony Stark, all these different things that are going on right now, the energy they put off reflects their current state of where they are in their lives and how they're feeling. And so what Ulysses does is grab all those energies, put them together and say, here's the most logical mathematic probability on what direction things are going to go in. It's not a future that he's seeing, it's just a relatively correct view. It's the logical outcome of things. And so I don't know if that makes any sense to you guys. I don't know if that clears things up a bit, but it's basically not the future that he's seeing. He's not actually leaving his mind and going into the future to see what happens. All he's simply saying is, well, Bruce Banner is working on Incredible Hulk research, and so, the mathematical probability of the Incredible Hulk reemerging is 80%. And so that's what his vision ends up giving him, is the most logical mathematic probability. The kicker about this is that was actually not Bruce Banner, the Incredible Hulk. That was Amadeus Cho. But the entire explanation as it's being given here by Tony Stark is really being given to like Carol Danvers, Captain America, Steve Rogers, all these guys, and Carol Danvers still doesn't want to listen when he basically says, hey, look, he's not seeing the future. He's just spouting out a mathematical probability. The question you ask Carol Danvers is, what percentage would be correct for you to act on this? If Ulysses said there's an 80% chance that, I don't know, Galactus is going to show up on Earth and he's going to attack the Earth, is that good enough? If there's a 10% chance that Thanos wants to acquire the Cosmic Cube, at what point do you draw the line? And that's a really legitimate argument here, because for Tony Stark, again, he's a futurist. And so what he's basically saying is, you have to let people commit acts. You have to arrest them for what they've done, not what you think they're going to do. Because then at that point, anybody could be arrested for anything. And so again, this just continues to make a rift, to create a rift between the two of them. It continues to create a rough circumstance. And the reason why is because during her dealings with regards to using the information of Ulysses, the first major error that had cropped up in his different views came from his belief that there was basically a woman or a banker where he saw her working as an agent of Hydra who was carrying a briefcase. Carol Danvers and S.H.I.E.L.D. stepped in. They arrested her for being an agent of Hydra, opened her briefcase, and didn't find anything in it. There's been no evidence to suggest over the course of her life that she's had anything to do with Hydra. She's, got a fiance, she lives a relatively quiet life, but Carol Danvers still believes she's guilty. And so because of this, she begins interrogating her. Now, of course, this woman's like, look, I have no idea what's going on. I'm not an agent of Hydra. I've never had anything to do with Hydra. All I want to do is go home. And because of this, or at least in the middle of all this, where Carol Danvers says she's guilty and all we have to do is just find the evidence to prove it, Nightcrawler basically teleports in and gets her out of there. And so what this does is this tells Carol Danvers that essentially Tony Stark is now taking up arms against her, that he's having his own guys go through and teleport people away, cause problems, and essentially lead into a major conflict between the two of them. What we do here is we essentially pick up with all these superheroes fighting each other. Now, the craziest thing about all this is that this is really just heroes fighting each other for a little while. I mean, there's really not a whole lot to it. It's pretty straightforward, but the other half of this and what Bendis focuses on is that Ulysses' powers are evolving and his powers are growing, that it's not just having visions anymore, that it's about his powers and his visions becoming a little more complex and in some ways a little darker. The other half of this is that Ulysses' visions are also getting to the point where he's able to discern them a little bit better and differentiate between those visions that are more likely to happen and those visions that are least likely to happen. The issue with this, though, is that as he goes through and he begins to witness this fight between all these different superheroes of Carol Danvers' team, of Iron Man's team, the Guardians of the Galaxy, the Extraordinary X-Men, the all new, all different Avengers, so on and so forth, what he does is he has another vision where he essentially shows everybody the idea of Miles Morales killing Steve Rogers. And so because of this, it's really Carol Danvers kind of panicking and actually moving towards the idea of arresting Miles Morales. Now, this is the point at which everybody turns against her, because she's talking about arresting a kid. It's one thing if it's an adult. It's one thing if it is somebody who was more likely to commit a crime. But Miles Morales has done nothing but fight the good fight. He's done nothing but be a superhero. He's not like Hawkeye, right? I mean, Hawkeye was a bad guy before he was a good guy. And even then, he wasn't really like a bad guy per se. He was just kind of a victim of circumstance. He was more or less duped into being a villain when he first showed up. He basically rectified his errors and then became part of the Avengers. But with the rest of these superheroes looking around and seeing that Carol Danvers is talking about the idea of arresting a child for a crime that he hasn't committed yet, Tony Stark kind of loses it and says, look, you're talking about a kid. You're talking about arresting a kid and treating them like they're an adult. Now, in truth, the only person who really should have anything to say here is Captain America, because he's the one that Miles Morales supposedly killed at some point in the future. And so, of course, Steve Rogers steps up. Now, remember, I can't keep harping this enough because I feel like it's something easy to forget. This is Hydra Captain America. And so while he puts on this show of, hey, look, like, let's be reasonable here, let's calm down. We have to make sure we're doing the right thing. This is all a show. This is all him acting the way he is for the purpose of creating a rift in the superhero and the Avengers community. And the way this comes about is when he basically says, hey, look, there may come a point where Miles Morales might kill me, but he hasn't done it yet. And until he does it, you guys don't need to do anything. In a lot of ways, because of the fact that he's so respected, Captain America's word is law. I mean, that's just the way it is. When Captain America says, we're going to do things a certain way, people are like, okay, let's go do it. Now, Carol Danvers doesn't want to listen to this. Carol Danvers is like, no. You can't just let him go like that. And Captain America's like, yes, I can. And he's going home. Thor, take him home. And Jane Foster, basically leaves, and Carol Danvers still wants to arrest him. And so because of that, because of all this, because she's basically turned to this point where nobody really seems to recognize her for, or I guess everybody's starting to see her for what she is, and somebody who's so dangerous, somebody who's willing to go to whatever lengths in order to make sure that her agenda is maintained, basically everybody begins turning against her. Of course, Tony Stark was already against her, but now Captain America's turning against her. S.H.I.E.L.D. is willing to arrest her. T'Challa, Black Panther, he essentially sits down and says, I will follow Captain America to the ends of the earth. Captain America is a man that I look up to. He's a man that I idolize. Even if I don't necessarily agree with everything that he does, I do recognize that the side that Captain America is on is always the right side. And so he says, look, I've been around this long enough. I've watched you screw up long enough. I've watched you make mistakes long enough. I'm not doing that anymore. I'm siding with Captain America. This kid's gonna go, and I'm out of here. I'm no longer in your corner anymore. Not only that, Iron Man's team takes off. The Inhumans basically abandon Carol Danvers, and so it's really just her. Now, at this point, this is when we start to get into Ulysses' powers beginning to grow and beginning to expand, because the Inhumans sit down and try to talk to him. The Inhumans are like, look, we need to talk to you right now, but he's wildly immersed in everything that's going on. In addition to this, all the other members of the superhero community are trying to figure out what to do next. Now, this is really just Marvel kind of setting the stage, right? I mean, this is Bendis saying, hey, look, guys, after Civil War II is over, we basically get into Marvel Now 2.0. That's how things were supposed to happen. This was really kind of like the Secret Wars fiasco all over again, in the sense that Secret Wars was supposed to finish, and then we were supposed to just segue right into all new, all different Marvel. But because of all the delays, the all new, all different Marvel titles started coming out before Secret Wars ended. That's basically what's happening here, with regards to Civil War II, in the sense that because of all the delays, Civil War II basically ended before the Marvel Now 2.0 titles came out. So for those of you guys who were getting into like Ultimate Squared, or those of you guys who are reading Unworthy Thor, different things like that, or who were reading, the new Iron Man with Riri Williams, a lot of these things were supposed to come out after this was finished. And so this should provide some clarity in terms of where these characters are coming from. Something else to note here, though, is that Riri Williams is still a part of what's going on with regards to these all new, all different Avengers. She's kind of a weird situation. She's kind of a mixed bag here, in the sense that she was really figuring out, what it is that she was capable of doing with regards to her makeshift Iron Man suit while this whole Civil War II event was going on. That was one of the major tie-ins of her character with regards to the backup features and the Invincible Iron Man line of stories under Brian Michael Bendis. But something else that I want to point your direction to is Carol Danvers herself. This is why I say that Brian Michael Bendis is so good at developing characters, because again, if you have this very visceral reaction to Carol Danvers in the sense that you hate her in the story so far, then Brian Michael Bendis has done his job. And that's really the mark of a good writer. Because if you were kind of going through this and you were like, whatever, Carol Danvers, I don't care, then the story didn't really resonate with you. But if you were anything like me, you hated Carol Danvers. You were mad as hell with Carol Danvers. And so Bendis was basically doing his job correctly. Not only that, he shows us that she is remorseful. In her mind's eye, she sees the face of James Rhodes in his final moments. In her mind's eye, she sees Bruce Banner dead. And in her mind, it's all because of her. It's all because she basically started all this. Now, she would never admit that publicly. And in fact, she refuses to. When we have Storm and the Extraordinary X-Men along with, Jean Grey and a handful of others to show up, she never comes out and says, look, I'm the reason why all this is going on. But a lot of it's because of the fact that there's no time to, because things are basically moving a mile a minute. Where Steve Rogers had told Thor, get Miles Morales out of here, and then Miles Morales had Thor drop him off before he got to his home, he ends up taking off and showing up on the Capitol steps in Washington, D.C., which of course is where Ulysses had the vision of him killing Captain America. And so this is again Carol Danvers acting in a reactive way. Now from here, we jump back to Ulysses, and this is actually where the story gets kind of cool, because now we get Andrea Sorrentino's art being mingled in with the art of David Marquez. Now, at least I think it's David Marquez. With this bit of storytelling here, this is basically Ulysses kind of leaving this plane of existence, so to speak, and actually traversing and meeting Old Man Logan. Now, the first person he encounters is a member of the Hulk's family, but of course, Old Man Logan kills him. But Bendis doesn't really give us like an explanation of exactly when this takes place. All we know is that this seems to be in the Old Man Logan universe, or a universe that is similar to it. But keep in mind, when it comes to those realities, when it comes to the stories, the future of the Old Man Logan universe, when it comes to Days of Future Past, those are all alternate realities. At some point along Marvel's timeline, that was the future. At some point along Marvel's timeline, Days of Future Past was the future until it was stopped, and then it became an alternate reality. At some point along the line, Old Man Logan was the future until it was stopped, and then it became an alternate reality. That's how that works. And so what Ulysses really seems to be doing is jumping into these different realities, all of which were at one point the future future of the main Marvel universe. And so because of this, when he's talking to Old Man Logan, this is basically the future of the Marvel Prime, the main Marvel universe, if the conflict between Tony Stark and Carol Danvers keeps on going in this direction. The problem with this is that he doesn't really get a whole lot of answers here. Well, he's talking to Old Man Logan. He's like, what led to all this? Where are we? What's going on here? Old Man Logan says, well, it was Tony Stark that happened. Tony Stark pushed her too far. He doesn't say who it was, and even when Ulysses asks, who is it that you keep referring to when you say he pushed her too far? Logan doesn't respond. He doesn't answer. Instead, Ulysses just kind of yanked back to the present day, and he's essentially just kind of talking to the Inhumans. So things are left a little ambiguous here. Not only that, we of course have Steve Rogers heading up to meet with Miles Morales. Now, this was also covered in the Nick Spencer Captain America Steve Rogers story, when he was basically acknowledging the possibility that going out and seeing Miles Morales here could possibly result in his death. But because of the fact that Steve Rogers is a Hydra agent, his goal was to bring down the superhero community and orchestrate the fall of superheroes in and of themselves, allowing Hydra to basically take its place. The problem with this is that in the midst of all this exposition between Carol Danvers and Miles Morales and Steve Rogers, we suddenly have Tony Stark making his appearance with his War Machine armor, or at least a more advanced iteration of his armor. The problem with this is that while Carol Danvers and Tony Stark are fighting one another, the indication here seems to be that Carol Danvers basically kills Tony Stark. Now, that's not necessarily the case in the sense that she does blast his armor, but the reason why Carol Danvers is able to do this is because, remember, she's still binary. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't know about when it comes to Carol Danvers, and I want to touch on this for a second. So way back in the day when she first showed up, she was just a woman who was part of the Air Force. There was nothing special about her, but she was enamored with Mar-Vell of the Kree, who operated as Captain Mar-Vell. Because of this, there came a point where she was basically exposed to the psych magnetron, and her desire to be the equivalent of Captain Mar-Vell resulted in her developing the powers that she had, and so she went forward as Miss Marvel. So that was really kind of the crux of her. That happened for quite some time, but Marvel really lost the ability to do anything special with her because they couldn't find any compelling stories. Now, eventually she was rolled over to the X-Men under Chris Claremont, and he basically made her this person that had the ability to absorb all different kinds of energy and then use those energy for her own ends, energy projection, enhanced strength, so on and so forth. And so she wasn't really a mutant per se, so much as somebody who just had these cosmic level powers to a degree. And so because of that, following the whole era of her being binary under Chris Claremont as part of the X-Men franchise, eventually she was rolled back over, and the binary element of her character was rarely ever seen, but it was something that still existed. And that's why if you go through and you look at Carol Danvers in like the 1990s going into the early 2000s and even up to the present day, every once in a while you would see her use energy blast, because that's something she's capable of doing. She doesn't use it very often, but she does from time to time. Now, having said that, and focusing again back on Ulysses, his continued experiences are really just tied directly into watching all these events unfold, and again, these possible futures. The problem with this is that as Carol Danvers and Tony Stark continue to fight one another, Ulysses' visions eventually lead him to the ethereal plane, to beyond the realm of normal existence. Not only that, he basically grabs the mind of Carol Danvers, Nova, Miles Morales, all these different heroes, and basically says, here are all the futures that I see. Here are all the things that could happen. There's futures where monsters run everything. There's futures where the X-Men have taken over the world. There are futures where Steve Rogers was killed by Miles Morales. There are all these different futures out there. Days of Future Past. Ultron takes over everything. There's all these different realities that exist, and then suddenly he moves beyond this normal plane of existence and he encounters eternity. Now, something I want to clarify here, because a lot of people have been asking this question about Marvel when it came to the idea of eternity being chained. In the Ultimates line of stories, eternity is in chains. In this story, he's not in chains. There's a reason for that. In Ultimates Squared, I think it was, Galactus actually revealed that the eternity that's in chains is the multiversal eternity. And that was something that had never really been explored before. It had to a degree mentioned maybe like once or twice, but it was nothing Marvel actually went with. Instead, all they ever said was, well, every universe has its own version of eternity. What Ultimates Squared revealed is that there is a multiversal eternity. There's one eternity that represents the multiverse. One eternity that represents all the different universes in the multiverse. That eternity is chained, but all the other eternities from within each universe, which are like these child units, so to speak, they're still able to operate accordingly. So again, it's kind of a weird situation with regards to Marvel in terms of what they're doing with their cosmic entities. It's a classic example of the left hand not knowing what the right hand's doing, and it's one of the reasons why, despite it being all new and all different, continuity errors still reign supreme. But the fact remains here that in this climactic battle, which does kind of feel a bit rushed, we basically have Tony Stark who's kind of left unconscious, and while he's not necessarily dead, he seems to be in this weird kind of catatonic state. Now, Bendis gives almost no explanation as to why this is. All he really has Beast say is that, well, Tony Stark's been experimenting on himself, and Beast is afraid to do anything because he doesn't know what kind of impact it'll have, and so they're just kind of leaving Tony Stark in this weird catatonic state. Now, we know by virtue of what Tony Stark has done that he's basically made himself a computer projection. We know this in the Iron Man stories and in Infamous Iron Man when he basically starts talking to Dr. Doom. When Dr. Doom becomes Iron Man. We also know this in the new Iron Man stories when he appears to Riri Williams as her new AI, or at least as the AI for her new suit. And so Tony Stark really seems to be kind of shunted off to the background right now, and he may come back at some point in time, but this is basically setting the stage for Tony Stark to be removed from the position of Iron Man, for Doctor Doom to take up the traditional Iron Man role, and then Riri Williams to have Tony Stark being her AI for when she becomes the Iron Man character. But again, things just kind of wrap up relatively fast. I mean, there's not a whole lot of exposition here. There's a lot of questions that are kind of left open-ended in terms of the fact that no one knows that Captain America is still a Hydra agent. We don't really know what direction things are going to go in with She-Hulk, but it's really kind of the situation where everybody's dealing with the fallout of Civil War II in their own ways. Again, you know, Riri Williams is becoming Iron Man. She-Hulk is still pissed off that Bruce Banner's dead. Captain America is still plotting for Hydra to take over the world. Miles Morales is still trying to deal with the realization that he was almost arrested for a future possibility of him killing Captain America. Is people really just kind of coming to terms with their own place in the superhero community, knowing the possible futures that could exist for them? Well, the story ultimately wraps up with some enigmatic phrase about Carol Danvers saying that she has some ideas for the future, but again, we don't really know what this means. But again, this story was kind of rushed in a lot of different ways, especially when it came to the ending. It really does reflect the notion that it was a story written for the purpose of just kind of being a cash grab on the main Civil War movie that was coming out, Captain America Civil War. Okay, so we are picking up with the hunt for, or I guess really the search for Tony Stark. This is a big story. This is something like 8 issues long or something like that. And Bendis doesn't usually do stories that long. For those of you guys who don't know, more often than not in Marvel Comics, most story arcs are about 6 issues long. For Iron Man, this comes after the events of Secret Empire. Now, of course, Secret Empire, as most people know, is one of my favorite stories ever when it comes to the character of Captain America. Well, really, it actually goes as far back as Civil War II, when Tony Stark was basically killed by Carol Danvers. Essentially, Tony Stark had just kind of been in a catatonic state. He was just in a coma, and that was it. And it was a way for like Marvel and Bendis to basically put him on the back burner, and then, you know, bring in Riri Williams as a character who I absolutely loved. But the fact remains here, when it comes to Tony Stark being in a catatonic state, there were a couple things that happened. The first was that you really saw like Amanda Armstrong picking up, really Amanda Armstrong and Mary Jane Watson picking up at his place, and we'll talk about them here in a second. And then you picked up with Tony Stark basically turning himself into an artificial intelligence, and then basically becoming the trainer for Riri Williams when she became the new Iron Man, more or less, when she was Ironheart. And so what this does is this initially picks up essentially at the Stark Expo, this whole, you know, event that Tony Stark puts on, you know, year after year in order to bring together some of the greatest minds. Now, Amanda Armstrong is really the one leading the charge on this whole project since Tony Stark is gone. Now, Amanda Armstrong was introduced as part of International Iron Man, and that dealt with the idea of Tony Stark tracking down his actual biological parents, because that was a holdover from Kieran Gillen, who had introduced the secret origin of Tony Stark and revealed that Howard and Maria were not actually his biological parents, and instead he was adopted. And so Bendis had kind of continued that trend going forward in the future of the Iron Man stories. And so in International Iron Man, he tracked down his actual mother, who was basically a rock star from like the 80s. And then we still don't know who his biological father is, or at least we know now that the story's finished, but at this point in the story, we don't know. And so basically Amanda's kind of going through and saying, hey, look guys, like we're putting on this whole Stark Expo because it's what Tony Stark would want. But from her perspective, this is a really crushing experience. And the reason why is because by and large, she never really got to know her son. And when it came to Tony Stark introducing himself and meeting Amanda for the first time, it was, hey, come back over here to Stark Industries, basically become the new CEO, which is something that he had implemented after he had essentially died. You know, that was part of his, you know, his last will and testament, but she never really got to know her son. Now, her and Mary Jane Watson have really been running the show ever since. Of course, Mary Jane Watson's involvement came by way of a combination of Dan Slott's Spider-Man and Brian Michael Bendis' Iron Man. But the idea here is that between the two of them, they're basically fending off the board of trustees. The board is trying to take over control of Stark Industries since Tony Stark isn't there. He was really like the one person keeping them at bay. And so because of the fact that Tony Stark might as well be dead for all intents and purposes, she ends up bringing in Riri Williams. Now, at this point, we transition to a guy named Eric Lynch. Now, Eric Lynch is one of the higher ranking members of the board, but he's one of these guys who's really been kind of like pushing the way for the board of trustees to be able to take everything over. And it's really just kind of like lying in wait and saying, hey, look, it's only a matter of time, only a matter of time before you guys screw up. What's been going on really off panel and behind the scenes here is that Eric Lynch and the board have been exhausting every conceivable legal option they have. And essentially what it's come down to is that because Tony Stark has been gone for so long, and because the company really is supposed to be owned by Tony Stark and the person who owns it isn't there, that gives all authority to the board of trustees. This is essentially a hostile takeover. Now, at this point, we transition away from like Riri and all that kind of stuff, and we focus on Doctor Doom. Now, this is where things get a little crazy, is because what you have had is you had Invincible Iron Man, and then you had like the new Iron Man with Doctor Doom. And with Infamous Iron Man, this story arc that took place with Doctor Doom, because there were two distinctly separate books, when it got to the end of International Iron Man and it got to the conclusion, basically going into like the end of Secret War, or I'm sorry, the end of Secret Empire with Bendis's Invincible Iron Man, he combined the two together. And that's why you see two distinctly different art styles, because as far as most everybody's been able to guess, they were supposed to be two distinctly different books. But with Bendis basically getting out of Marvel, handing the reins over to whoever it is that comes next, the result is that they were just kind of crammed into a singular book. But the idea here is this is really more of like Bendis's take almost on the events of New Avengers. It's kind of a way for him to sort of bring that back. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what that means, back in the day, with Avengers being one of those titles that was ailing, because a lot of people think Avengers has always been successful. It's actually not true. Throughout the 90s, the only real successful titles Marvel had were Spider-Man and the various X-Men related titles. When the Avengers title was canceled with Avengers Disassembled and then relaunched as New Avengers, the first story arc was called The Raft, and it dealt with the idea that the villain Electro had been contracted by Elektra to essentially break all the prisoners out of the raft. And it was a way to kind of bring the New Avengers team together, but this is very much a repeat of that. And the reason why is because at Rikers Island, a whole bunch of people have escaped. Now, this is really just kind of a repeat of that in the sense that you have Infamous Iron Man, Doctor Doom, who basically responds, and there's a handful of people who have escaped. Now, we'll figure out who these guys are, but of course, this also sort of ties into the idea that Ben Grimm doesn't really trust Infamous Iron Man. Now, one thing to bear in mind here, for those of you guys who have been watching for a little while, this took place before the events of Marvel 2-in-1. So that's one of the reasons why you don't really see Ben Grimm and Doctor Doom on good terms. And they, even during 2-in-1, they weren't really on good terms. But this takes place before that. But switching back over to Amanda and everybody, what you end up finding out here is basically the body of Tony Stark has vanished. The reason why this is so significant is because of the fact that with Tony Stark having been part of the superhero community for a long time, having been director of S.H.I.E.L.D., being really one of the founding members of the Avengers, having faced off and sided with the X-Men, he knows a lot. I mean, his hands are in everything. And so if somebody were to get their hands on him and then simply like start forcing him to divulge information, they could bring the entire security infrastructure of the world crashing down, to say nothing of how easily they'd be able to take out the various Avengers. Now, from here, what we end up doing is basically picking up with the arrival of a guy by the name of Hijack. Now, when it comes to David Bond, the reason why they call him Hijack is because of the fact that he literally hijacks vehicles, like, technological stuff. Now, he originally made his appearance back in 2013, I'm pretty sure, with Uncanny X-Men Volume 3, issue number 6. I'm not going to swear by that, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. But he was a Brian Michael Bendis creation. Now, anybody who's familiar with Bendis will tell you, more often than not, he'll use his own creations, or he'll use things that he's previously done to kind of push along stories that he's writing at the time. But Hijack showing up is really just like, he's basically a merc. Like, he's here because he was hired by the Stark Board of Directors to essentially bring down like Riri Williams and all that kind of good stuff. Now, this is one of the funny things, because the suit that Riri has was not designed by Tony Stark himself. It was designed by her, but Tony Stark has been influencing her and teaching her how to use these different things. But when it comes to this whole thing and this situation popping off, for the most part, is her just sort of taking guidance from Tony Stark, kind of outflying these various forces and so on and so forth, and then eventually getting outside the range of Hijack to the point that he can't really control these ships anymore. And then ultimately she ends up just kind of crash landing, and where she makes her escape anyway, and then ends up crash landing in her own neighborhood, things like that. Of course, this also comes by way of Mary Jane Watson macing David Bond. of macing Hijack in order to take his concentration away. But it's kind of a cool little thing here. That's one of the cool things about Bendis writing, is that a lot of times he'll focus on smaller characters who normally wouldn't really have anything to contribute, but then gives them something as small as it is, and it just makes all the difference. And again, it's just kind of a way to develop characters. But the fact remains here, when it comes to really to Doctor Doom Iron Man, just kind of an aside, not a great big huge thing. This will become important later on, but basically the guys who were broken out of Rikers Island are essentially like targeting him, really more just kind of like harassing him, bothering him, trying to find a way to like defeat him and kill him. Now, these are small time guys, Living Laser, different things like that. Nobody who was ever really significant. And so what we end up doing is picking up, of course, when Riri Williams crashes back in her local neighborhood, and she's talking to Xavier. And that's one of the cool things I like about Riri's character. For the most part, I've always loved her. Like, I always thought the development behind her was awesome, but she's also like this young girl. And when you're looking at someone like her who is trying to step into the role of becoming the new Iron Man, it is kind of funny because you have a tendency to sort of forget she's a teenage girl, which means she goes through teenage girl phases. There's all those small little things, being nervous around boys, boys that she likes, different things like that. And it's kind of a cool moment. But once she gets inside, we basically end up finding out that like her home is being rummaged through by like essentially, groups that, or I guess, a handful of people who were sent here by Stark Enterprises, by the board of directors. And they're really pulling out all the stops. Now, the way that Riri plays this is actually pretty smart. She basically says the entire place is not really booby trapped, but being monitored by like 17 separate cameras. And that if they end up basically saying, hey, look, we're going to continue with this, then like the whole thing will be turned into a video and then it'll be sent out there, which is kind of a significant moment. And so what we end up doing is actually transitioning to Tony Stark proper. Now, this is where things get a little hairy. Tony Stark just kind of fell out of this birthing container. That's really what it was. He just kind of fell out of a container of sorts, and we have no idea where he is. We have no idea how he got there. Instead, he's met by the arrival of his mother. Now, this really looks like a newborn Tony Stark. That's really how this appears in terms of the way he's drawn, designed, all that kind of good stuff. But the idea seems to be he's still in possession of all of his memories up to the modern day. Now, is it a cheap way to bring Iron Man back? Definitely. But how do you really bring Tony Stark back after he's quote unquote dead? You know, after he's essentially dead. But it's kind of interesting because as he goes through and starts talking to really his mother, they have this really, really touching, tender moment here. And it's him basically saying like, the one thing that allowed me to hold on is that it was basically you. Like what I've done is I've essentially rebooted myself, mind, body, and soul. I'm a recreated version of myself. When he's talking to her and he's kind of having this moment, it's like, hey, look, I always wanted us to meet. I always wanted us to see each other. And then you have Mary Jane Watson who walks in, you know, and Mary Jane Watson is like, well, you know, they're on their way. Everybody's showing up here. Everyone's been looking for you. And then he's met with a full contingent of the Avengers. I mean, everyone, you know, like Riri Williams and Moon Knight and like Storm and Vision and all that kind of stuff. You know, the X-Men are there. I mean, it's like the entire Marvel superhero community because of the fact that he's such a significant and important member, only for us to find out that James Rhodes is also there. And this is when we start to realize the whole thing is an illusion. It's basically a dream that he's having. And the reason why is because James Rhodes is dead. James Rhodes died, you know, in really in the lead up to Civil War II. And so it's kind of a cool moment here. It's actually kind of interesting because when you're talking about this return of Tony Stark, it would have been a pretty easy situation to just say, and now he's back, done, you know, and it's like a 2-issue story. But to see Bendis kind of drag it out and sort of, you know, invoke all this character involvement is interesting because then what we do is we basically pick up with the arrival of Parker Robbins. Now, Parker Robbins was a character created by Brian K. Vaughan. He originally appeared in his own solo series called The Hood. And he's one of these interesting guys. He's not really on the level of Doctor Strange, but he's not a baseline human. He can kind of manipulate magic to a degree, and he basically fights demon energy or shoots demon energies from his guns. The difference here with the Hood is that he's actually achieved a lot of pretty significant things in terms of his supervillain career. I mean, he was inspired to become a supervillain. That's one of the reasons why he does what he does, but he's essentially really good at forming what is, for the most part, like the Masters of Evil. For those of you guys who don't know, back in the day, the Masters of Evil, if I remember correctly, I want to say it was a Roy Thomas creation. But anyway, it was basically an alliance of the most notable villains at the time that were basically villains of the Avengers. The rosters sort of changed over the years when it came to the Masters of Evil. But with Parker Robbins forming his own kind of army, the roster also changed as well. But that's why you see small-time guys like Living Laser, because the Masters of Evil were people like Radiation Man, Ulysses Claw, small-time villains that even at that point in time weren't super relevant. They weren't really that big of a deal. But basically, Parker Robbins shows up and like turns his guns on Dr. Doom. And so it's really kind of one of these things where Bendis leaves us on like a minor cliffhanger, like a small little cliffhanger. And so what ends up happening here is Amanda starts to put 2 and 2 together, right? The mother of Tony Stark starts to put 2 and 2 together, and she's talking to like all the Avengers, like the Mighty Avengers and the whole 9 yards. I mean, it's like it's Black Panther, it is Luke Cage, it's Spider-Man. I mean, it's all these different characters. And the response is, we have no idea where Tony Stark is. No one can find him. This guy's off the radar. Now, this is kind of a cool thing, and it's actually an important thing to remember. And the reason why is because when it comes to someone like Tony Stark, when he was director of S.H.I.E.L.D., while he wasn't necessarily on the same level as like Nick Fury, he still has a much higher level of intelligence, but also access to everything that was going on with regards to S.H.I.E.L.D. He did learn about all these little nooks and crannies and secret locations and places like that here and there. And that's the reason why wherever Tony Stark is, he's totally off the reservation. Nobody can find him because no one knows the different places that he knows. It's just things that he was privy to as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. or figured out along the way. And this is when Amanda kind of starts putting 2 and 2 together. She's like, if Friday is the AI of Tony Stark that he created before he died, then she's a program. She does what she's programmed to do, and she's programmed to protect Tony Stark. And the response of Amanda Armstrong is, if she's programmed to protect Tony Stark, then then she has to know the location of Tony Stark. And of course, Friday's response to this whole interrogation is, I really don't know where he, I don't know where he is. The only way for me to know would be to basically be in his head. And that's when she jumps into the AI construct of Tony himself that's been helping out Riri Williams this entire time. And it's the coolest thing, because when she jumps in, she basically kind of switches bodies, kind of switches them back. And And really the question that's asked here is, where is Tony Stark? And the AI construct of Tony simply responds by saying, well, to be fair, no one ever asked me directly where he was, indicating this version of Tony knows exactly where real world Tony Stark is. Like, and it's kind of funny because it's like, well, all they ever had to do was ask. Okay, so we are continuing on with Invincible Iron Man, and it's actually kind of cool. I mean, I'm pretty excited about this because this is basically the return of Tony Stark, but it's one of these things where you can tell that Bendis had somewhat set the stage for what was supposed to come after this. Now, whether or not it was the plan of Bendis to do this and then continue writing and then ultimately jump ship and head over to DC Comics where the ship's not sinking, then, you know, we don't really know. Like, we don't know if that's the case or not. At this point, it's just kind of like Bendis set it up for things to come after this. So in reality, it's really kind of like anybody's guess on what direction things going. But initially this picks up really with Parker Robbins. Now, again, we talked about in the last video that Parker Robbins, the Hood, has really kind of been on this campaign to try to take out Victor Von Doom. Now, we didn't initially know why this was the case. Instead, it was basically Parker Robbins kind of reforming this sort of modern day masters of evil, more or less, using some pretty low level thugs and then launching these little, you know, small time attacks against Dr. Doom, only for us to find out that the reason why he's doing this is because his goal is to basically steal the gold in Latveria. That's essentially the goal of Parker Robbins here, is to steal gold in Latveria. It's a pretty primitive goal, but then again, Parker Robbins was never really that great of a villain in the first place. And so it's one of the cool things that actually goes on here. It's one of the interesting situations. What we end up finding out is that one of the guys he's brought along, a guy by the name of Corruptor, has the ability to basically create these kind of this sort of psychoactive effect in the mind to force people to see like hallucinations or to have the body react in an exceedingly violent way, but he can only do it through like physical contact. But it's kind of a cool thing because then at this point, we switch over to Tony Stark. Now remember, Tony Stark, you know, despite the fact that he's kind of resurrected himself more or less in like a new body, basically, he's been having these hallucinations, you know, with regards to like members of the superhero community and even his own family. And in this instance, he has a hallucination of his dad. Now, in reality, this is really more of like a subconscious concept working its way to the conscious mind and then him basically dealing with it, specifically with regards to the fact that he was adopted, because this was a concept that Tony Stark never really dealt with proper, in the sense that like he knew that he was adopted, but he never really was able to come to terms with his father about it because his father was dead. But in this moment, when he's kind of going through this sort of hallucinogenic state, when his mind is sort of restructuring itself and when his body's physically recovering, he kind of has this internal argument with his father about the fact that, you know, like, well, you never told me I was adopted, different things like that. But a really cool point's made here is that Howard Stark basically says, well, the fact that you're adopted is irrelevant. Like, you're still my son. Like, I raised you as my son. I taught you everything you know. I left you an empire. You know, I am as good as. And in reality, it's true. While Tony Stark is adopted, the fact that Howard Stark taught him everything he needed to know about what it meant to be a man, to be successful, to build on his intelligence, those are the only things that really matter. You know, his father was never in his life. His father was never there to teach him those lessons. Howard Stark was the one who was. And so really, if Tony hadn't been told that he was adopted, everything would still stand. Everything would still be the same. So there really is no difference here between Howard and the actual father of Tony. But the actual father of Tony will make an appearance here in a little while. Now, something else that's been going on here is that Friday has basically been kind of subverting her programming to a degree and going through and like hunting down or trying to trace down the location of Tony Stark, which they were ultimately successful in doing. And it was actually an old shield bunker. So again, kind of hitting back at the old Nick Fury era of comics where he always had these safe houses. But when they get in there, they end up finding the armor that Tony Stark was in, but he's basically outside of his armor now. He's essentially left. And so it's kind of cool because he's out there doing his own thing, presumably trying to find a way to come back. Now, another funny little caveat here, this is kind of wild, is what ends up happening is that while Riri Williams is pondering the idea of walking away because all of her tech was basically taken by Stark Industries by the board of trustees, when she's sitting there basically mulling over the idea of returning to MIT, she's met with the arrival of Blade. Now, apparently Blade works for S.H.I.E.L.D. I have no idea. It's been 15 years since I read a Blade comic, so I can't tell you what in the world Blade's been doing all this time. I mean, I remember him from the movie, and that's it. Like, it's I know almost nothing about Blade. Anything that's happened in the last 15 years, I don't know. But she ultimately ends up basically traveling back to MIT. Now, when she does, what we end up finding out here is that there are a handful of people who are basically trying to track down Tony Stark in addition to Riri Williams herself. One of them is Tony Ho, actually the daughter of Jensen Ho, the person that helped Tony Stark build the Mark I when he was kidnapped in Vietnam. And then the other one, or really there's a couple others, but one of them is Arno Stark. Now, if I'm being honest here, I don't really like the way that Bendis handles Arno Stark. He's just kind of like a guy who's there. And that's sort of disappointing because for those of you guys who read Kieran Gillen's run of Iron Man, Arno Stark played a huge role. The idea of him, you basically, of it being revealed that Arno is the actual biological son of Howard and Maria, that he's basically smarter than Tony Stark, that he's kind of reduced here to just being a guy who needs the help of Riri Williams in order to crack a code. It's kind of weird because it's like saying like Reed Richards can't figure something out on his own, and so he has to go to Iron Man to do it. I mean, you're talking about one of the smartest people on the planet. So the fact that Arno Stark would need anybody is a little mind-boggling here. It's a little weird to me. But again, it does give a pretty cool role to Riri in the sense that she has something to contribute here. But at this point, we basically end up dealing with Iron Man being more or less defeated by Parker Robbins. Now, it's really more of a smaller thing, but this whole situation basically has him traveling back to Liberia, and then basically Parker Robbins arriving with this huge, army of street-level thugs, basically, and then all of them using their various powers to take down Dr. Doom as Iron Man. Now, it's kind of a funny thing here because Bendis is somewhat playing on the idea that Dr. Doom is, quote-unquote, reformed, right? I mean, if this was classic Dr. Doom from like Fantastic Four Annual #2 or #4, whatever it is, he would have just made short work of him. He would have just killed them all, and that would have been the end of it. He would have just been like, you're done. Like, you guys are all dead. But the fact that he's kind of trying to turn over a new leaf, trying to do the right thing, basically means that it's a way for them to subvert his power, to essentially overcome him, and then in turn defeat him. Now, some of it's also because of the fact that there's just so many people there that they just basically overwhelm him. The problem with this is that once they manage to get through, they manage to essentially like break into his armor, he's gone. He's basically teleported out. And so that information is basically gone with him. And so again, it's essentially Parker Robbins kind of sitting around and saying, okay, in order for us to find the location of the gold in Latveria, we have to track down Tony Stark because that's where Dr. Doom is going to go. He's going to go find Tony. And so again, it's kind of like this mad rush. Everybody's looking to find Tony Stark. Now, switching back to Blade, what we end up finding out here is that in this whole situation, what had basically happened is he had gone to Riri Williams and said, a lot of people are looking for Tony Stark, or at least what used to be S.H.I.E.L.D. It's not really S.H.I.E.L.D. anymore after Secret Empire, but it's like a lot of people are looking for Tony Stark. You need to go to MIT because there are people there that will help you find Tony, which of course now we know is Arno and Tony Ho and so on and so forth. But with them basically banding together and then going to seek out Tony, what ends up happening is Friday's software is totally corrupted. She's basically possessed by Tony Stark himself, who literally says, stop looking for me. Like, I have things I need to take care of. Stop trying to track me down. Like, let me go do my thing, and then I will come and find you when the time is right. And so it's kind of a cool moment here. It's a cool little segment to see that Tony Stark, despite the fact that he is believed to have been dead, or at the very least, he's operating on bare bones tech, is still able to outclass almost everybody there. Now, what Tony actually ends up doing is traveling directly to meet his mother and basically say, hey, look, there's a few things that I'm sorting out here. But it's kind of cool because that's the connection between the two of them is pretty strong. And remember, they've only recently met each other. And so it's like the one thing Tony's been trying to figure out is how to get back to his mom and say, hey, look, here's where things stand. Everything's okay. She's kind of freaked out that he's bald a little bit. And he's like, well, I basically resurrected myself in a new body. So, that happens. But what Tony does is also throw her a microphone of sorts and say, like, tell me about my biological father. Now, this is the first real indication we actually get about this. The idea of Tony Stark's biological father was neither hide nor hair. You didn't see anything about it. And even actually like his biological mom here, Amanda, we didn't see anything about that until like International Iron Man. So it was a few years after the introduction of the idea that Tony was adopted before we ever even saw any real expansion on that. Now, a lot of that was because Kieran Gillen took off. He basically left and went to go do his own thing. But it is an interesting scenario because what we end up finding out here is that the father of Tony Stark was a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent who turned Hydra. And he actually started selling out S.H.I.E.L.D. agents to Hydra. And it's interesting. I'm not 100% sure how I feel about that. But again, it's kind of a cool situation because what it does is it creates a potential enemy for Tony, in the sense that like, what was his father doing? What were the kind of things that he was getting into? So on and so forth. And then the plot gets even crazier. This is the problem with Bendis writing is occasionally he'll just go off the reservation. But this is actually pretty cool. In the middle of their attempt to find Tony Stark, Riri Williams, Tony Ho, all those guys are met with the arrival of Leonardo da Vinci. Now, on the surface, people are just kind of like, okay, this is ridiculous. And maybe it is to a degree. But recently, we're actually going all the way back. Jonathan Hickman started, I think it was Jonathan Hickman and Nick Dragotta, although I don't remember who it was that actually drew it. They launched a series called S.H.I.E.L.D. And it was a mini series that went 4 issues and then was unfinished for like 7 years or something crazy like that. And recently, issues 5 and 6 were finished. But that was basically the story of like the origin of S.H.I.E.L.D. And Leonardo da Vinci was a member of a group called the Brotherhood of the Shield, which was the precursor to S.H.I.E.L.D. itself. And so there were a whole lot of things that took place. They were the first ones to fight Galactus. They were the first ones to repel the Celestials. There were a lot of different things that were going on. There was a lot of changing that was going on in the realm of Marvel Comics. And it's a really, really cool story. We might cover it at some point. It's actually pretty awesome dealing with all that history in the Marvel Universe. But again, what we also end up finding out here is that where Amanda Armstrong had basically told Tony, look, like I killed your father. Essentially is what happened. Your father turned out to be a Hydra agent and I killed him to protect you. We end end up finding out that his father's actually alive. And it's cool here because again, what this means is this could play a very big role in the life of Tony Stark, tracking down his Hydra agent father. Now, this also follows up with Tony trying to make amends and trying to fix things essentially by resurrecting James Rhodes. Now, with James Rhodes being brought back, with his mind essentially being downloaded into like a new consciousness of sorts, things just kind of pick up as if they never stop. In the sense that like James Rhodes essentially has all the memories of everything that happened, even the fact that he was killed by Thanos. But what we also kind of end up doing is, with James Rhodes being resurrected, it's a chance for him and Tony Stark to meet, but for Tony Stark to also sort of get him back in gear, get him ready to be War Machine, and then we switch back over to Leonardo da Vinci. Now, the fact that Leonardo da Vinci helped to establish S.H.I.E.L.D., he kind of gives us a sort of backstory and simply saying that like he's been watching from the shadows the entire time. And where S.H.I.E.L.D. was basically corrupted, where it was essentially brought down by Steve Rogers, and where S.H.I.E.L.D. had kind of grown into this sort of unwieldy, giant, massive intelligence organization that could have presumably brought everything crashing down, which ultimately ended up happening in Secret Empire, that S.H.I.E.L.D. did not maintain its original charter to be a protector of all life on Earth. That's really the original basis behind its formation by Leonardo da Vinci and a handful of others. And so because of this, da Vinci has kind of gone back and sort of reworked what S.H.I.E.L.D. is supposed to be, not in the sense that he's recreated it, but in the sense that he's kind of making something akin to it. But it is kind of cool because like Miles Morales, for example, is brought in. It's really kind of like a veritable who's who of people who have dealt with Iron Man or who were exceedingly smart or capable in their own right. There's a variety of reasons of, for why people are being brought in here. But the fact remains that what we end up basically doing is picking up with Parker Robbins when we end up learning that with him going after Tony Stark in order to beat Dr. Doom there, and then basically realizing that Tony Stark is missing and that the board of directors, essentially, Eric Lynch, is trying to go through and seize control of the company. Parker Robbins sees it as a means to rule directly. What Parker Robbins does is he basically approaches Eric Lynch and he's like, I can smell a coward from a mile away, and you are certainly a coward. And so the idea is, I've got a gun to your head. You're going to give me power of attorney over like your whole position. And so you're going to step down. I will step into your role, and then I will run Stark Industries. It's actually a genius idea. Now, of course, when you have James Rhodes and then you have Tony Stark respond, as well as Dr. Doom, Iron Man, all showing up at the same time, it's like this massive conflict against the forces of Parker Robbins alongside like all these Iron Man guys. Now, the fight is not supremely drawn out. And so one of the things that ends up happening when Parker Robbins goes to attack Dr. Doom, what he does is kind of undo what it was that Reed Richards did in terms of fixing his face and go back to scarring his face again. Now, this really looks to set the stage for like Dr. Doom going back to his classic outfit. Now, how you do that, I don't really know, because Dr. Doom's face was fixed by the power of the Beyonders, these nigh omnipotent, multiversal beings that destroy the cosmic entities, But once the whole conflict is basically, once it ends, once it all comes crashing down, then what you end up having is Riri Williams, who's essentially kind of taken under the wing, I guess, again, by Tony Stark, as well as James Rhodes, who comes back as War Machine. And then it's just kind of like, what comes next? That's really sort of the question that's lingering here, is what's going to happen after this? Now, of course, also Dr. Doom's face is all scarred to pieces. So again, this whole idea that he's going to go back and turn into, Victor Von Doom again, especially because of the fact that he's essentially rebuilding Latveria, setting things back to rights, returning to the role that he's supposed to be. Again, it's very much been just kind of, wrapping up these loose ends from the story as it's existed since the beginning of All New, All Different Marvel, running up to the modern day, as well as bringing Dr. Doom back to the original Dr. Doom. So again, it's one of these things where Marvel's setting things back to the classic way, to the way that they used to be, the way that they've been doing it for 60 years, going back to the same old thing. So, it's kind of got a mixed reaction. For me, as somebody who's been reading comics for so long, it's the same old thing I've been seeing before, which actually takes me away from being interested in it. But for the new person, it's all new to them. It's all like, I've never seen anything like this before. So it's kind of it's fresh stuff for all of them, for all you new guys. So, I'm kind of curious. I mean, what's your all's take on this? Like, are you guys in favor of like the new direction of things, telling new stories that we haven't seen before? Or are you guys in favor of the classic things and just kind of rehashing older stories in different ways? But with that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.